When I talk about self-sovereignty, I talk about sovereignty over the self. And obviously I've studied this all my life. It's been my raison d'etre to study sovereignty over the self. And the old scriptures and Zen talk a lot about the fact that if you're sovereign over yourself, it's more powerful than being sovereign over 10,000 armies. And when it says that, obviously it sounds exciting. You think, oh, there's real power there. But it's actually literally true, because we are made up of 50 trillion cells. There are 50 trillion cells in me. And each of those cells is identical to who I am. It's got the identical DNA. So it's like 50 trillion individual me's inside this body. And if we can align those 50 trillion selves with a strong purpose or with a strong perception, we can create an amazing reality. So when I do a sovereignty course, or any of the courses that I do, when I do mentoring or when I do one-on-ones, or if I'm doing this kind of stuff, we're not just it isn't just like a theological idea of, or a metaphorical idea of, having power. It's a literal power over the self, or power over the 50 trillion selves, over the, over every cell of our body. When you look at these 50 trillion cells, we recognise that these 50 trillion cells in our body are all waiting for our command. Every one of them is led by perception. The whole world is based on perception. Money is perception, politics is perception, government is perception, wars are perception. Wars are won and lost. Wars are created by perception. If we have a perceived enemy, or if we have someone that we believe is an enemy, we go to war with them. We create, global catastrophes because of perception. Fortunes are won and lost on perception. Health is created and destroyed by perception. Friendships are won and lost on perception. All businesses are based on perception. If the organism is right, then the organisation is right. If the self is right, then the business is right, because it is a projection of that. So we're not just talking, metaphorical. It's not just something that sounds exciting or something that sounds good. We're talking literally. So when we talk to people about mastering their palate, when we talk to people about, mastering their sensual body and their physical body, and controlling their mind body, and having a sentinel ego in place, this is basically what I do on my self-sovereignty course. The self-sovereignty course is all based on aligning 50 trillion cells. That's what we do. That's what we're aiming to do. We're aiming to do that so that if we can change perception, because perception leads our cells, and the cells are what create our reality. If we can lead the cells, we can create the reality. So in order to do that, we have to recognise it's led by perception, and we have to recognise that 95% of perception is unconscious. So 95% of our perception is what we were born with. So our genes and our cells, give us a starting point. They give us our genetic information, the things that we brought down, that we've learned from our parents and from our grandparents and from our great-grandparents. So historically, we're born with information in the cells, in the genes, and current science is saying that even genetic information, like if we have if we have lots of people in our family that have certain kinds of cancer or certain kinds of traits, that can be changed. Genes can be changed. It can be reversed. They used to think that, if it was in the genes, that was it. It was set. But actually, that can be changed as well. Everything can be changed. So when we recognise that 95% of our perceptions are based on are unconscious, in other words, what we've been born with and what we learnt, specifically between the ages of 1 and 6. It's what Freud said, your internal parent, or your superego, or the second self, was created between the ages of 1 and 6. So everything that went on, everything that you put onto your child between the ages of 1 and 6 goes in unobstructed. It's like between the ages of 1 and 6, children are in a hypnotic state. So everything everything you put in will stick. Everything you put in will not be challenged. Discernment doesn't come in until after the age of 6. After the age of 6, children start to discern, what is this good, isn't it good, what's right, what's wrong. But up to the age of 6, everything will go in as fact. So who we are is largely determined by what we learn between the ages of 1 and 6. So all of our perceptions, well, 95% of our perceptions are based on unconscious scripts, unconscious perceptions. So if we've got 5% of us that are going, I want to do this, I'm going to achieve that, I'm going to go there, I'm going to go on a diet, I'm going to get healthy, I'm going to start a business. We've got 5%. If the 5% says, I'm going to change the world, and 95% says you're not capable of changing the world because you're not educated enough, or because you're not smart enough, or because you're not beautiful enough, or because you're not brave enough. If the 95% of these perceptions, normally mostly false perceptions that are given to us by our parents and by our class and by our conditioning, by our teachers, if those are wrong, which in my case most of them were, then we've got a small 5% trying to battle against the 95%. It doesn't give you much, it doesn't give you much chance to actually to win that battle. This is what in the Hindu text they call the sea of nescience, or the battle of Guru, etc. So when Arjuna goes into battle, and there's tens of thousands of armies there, and he goes into battle to fight to win his kingdom back, because his kingdoms have been stolen by his corrupt cousins. In other words, his potential has been stolen by negative cognition. All he can take into the battle is consciousness, which is represented by Krishna on the chariot, and truth. So he goes in and he takes on this big battle against his own perceptions, against his own cognition, or against his own karma, if you like. And he needs truth, he needs discernment, he needs consciousness, he needs to shine the light of consciousness. He needs to, it's what in the Yoga Vashishta they're called inquiry. He needs to inquire into that 95%. So when the 95% comes up, or the inborn and the learned perceptions come up and say, you're not good enough, you are not enough, you're not perfect, you haven't got this potential, this kingdom is not yours, that's naive, you're a piece of shit. Lots of people I work with have this real belief that they are nothing, they're not worth anything. And that's because their perceptions are sitting just below the surface all the time. So the idea is that in order for us to be in charge of these 50 trillion cells, we have to recognise that, and realising that they are led by perception, we have to realise that we need to change perception. But if 95% of the perceptions are false, or they're unconscious, and they're rising up with, with negative scripts, or old scars, or core beliefs, small core beliefs, fundamental beliefs, dogmatic beliefs, we have to go to war with those old perceptions. In other words, we have to challenge those old perceptions. So when we want to move forward and we say, I'm going to be a writer, and we move forward and this voice rises up and says, you're not good enough to be a writer, people like you don't write books, which is what happened to me, we have to challenge that. We have to change that perception. And the only way we can change that perception is to go into that perception, sit in that perception, which means sitting in fear, or sitting in ignorance and inquiring, and change that perception. It's not enough to just do mantras all day and say, I'm good, I'm a good person, I'm positive, because it's just 5% of conscious perception trying to challenge 95%. So the way we change perception, and I learned this when I was talking to someone the other week. I was talking to some guys in a prison, and I said, the whole world is based on perception, your whole reality. He said, how do you change perception? And of course I had to really think what the answer was, and I said, well, ultimately you change perception by going into old perceptions and disproving them. You know, deconstructing old truths and reconstructing new truths. This is what Yudhisthira in the Mahabharata called expanding the second self. Expanding core beliefs. Dissolving old core beliefs, creating new beliefs, wider beliefs. One of the ways we do that is by being around people who are already doing what it is we want to do. So when we do the sovereignty course, for instance, you've got people on, you're sitting around with people who are creating the most amazing things. I'll give you an example. One of my friends, Dave, was on the course. We've become really good friends. And he's a fireman. And every year he goes into the fire brigade World Games. He's a power lifter. And it's a big event, you know, it's like something like 80 countries. Every year he enters into that, but he's never placed because his perception was that he won't place, he's not good enough to place, and that's because there's some core belief there that believes, you know, him being world champion isn't possible. Suddenly he's in this room with half a dozen, it's a very small class, with half a dozen other people who are really big achievers, people, you know, who are achieving amazing things in their life. Not, you know, not all businessmen, just people that are achieving magnificent things. You know, someone that's overcome cancer, someone that runs a multinational company, you know, somebody that's perhaps, you know, broken lots of records, somebody that's written a best-selling book, or you know, somebody that's managed to break out of old conditioning and leave the factory and become what he wanted to become, you know, like a full-time martial artist. Or so suddenly, just by being in this class, just by being around these people, just by being around the proof that everything is possible if you change perception, his perception changed. Now he had to have the last session of the sovereignty course. He had to miss the last session. He told me this at the very beginning. He said, I can come on, but I have to miss the last session because I'm going to the World Games. And he was touch and go whether he went to the World Games or not, because he didn't want to miss the last session. And I said, well, it's important that you go. Anyway, I went to the World Games and he won the world title. He became the world champion. And and he said afterwards, he said he was able to win it because he suddenly became aware that it was possible, not that it was possible to win it, but it was possible for him to win it. So he changed his perception by being around other people who had already changed their perceptions and were doing amazing things. He expanded just by being in the company. So people would say to me, well, when I come on this course, or when I do this course, what will happen? What will it give me? What will it give me that I'm not going to get on other courses? And I said, well, I don't know exactly what it'll give you because everyone's individual. All I know is that during the 6 months you will expand. You will expand because you're around people who have already expanded, and they will expand because you've expanded in your area. Everybody brings something. So it's like very informal, and it's very relaxed, and it's in a beautiful environment. So the environment itself expands you. But the most important thing is that you are collecting intellectual proof that expansion and change of perception is possible. So my friend's perception was that wasn't possible, not for him. Now that he's won this world title, his perception has completely changed. So if that old script rises up and said, possible but not possible for the likes of you, he doesn't even rise up because he dismisses it straight away. Because he knows he's done it. He's been out and actually done it. So my perception as a younger guy was that people like me can't become writers. There was no intellectual proof in my life that that was possible. And I could never ever see myself as a writer. Every time I tried to see myself, these old scripts from the 95% of unconscious perceptions rose up and said, not for you. Not for the likes of you. So every time I moved towards a new perception, this 5% of me, it got battered by the 95%. And that 95% was also represented in the people around me. So if I wasn't thinking it wasn't possible, they were telling me it wasn't possible, challenging me and attacking me calling me pretentious, saying not for the likes of you, don't get above your station, who do you think you are? So every time you stepped outside the periphery of what you thought was possible, you got battered. And of course, in that kind of environment, you learnt to batter other people. So if other people wanted to achieve big things, you would be part of the people that would attack them. As they tried to move towards other things, you would ridicule them or attack them or think, who do they think they are? They think they're something special. Somebody said to me recently, people are saying, Geoff, that you think you're God. And I said, well, listen, I don't think I'm God. I fucking know I'm God. There's no think about it. All of the scriptures tell you the same. When you surrender to God, God surrenders to you. When you surrender to potential, if God's the wrong word for you, if you surrender to your potential, you surrender. If you surrender to your potential surrenders to you. Wherever you surrender to, you become. If you surrender to mediocrity, that becomes your God. If you surrender to smallness and dogma, that becomes your reality. If you, of course, why wouldn't it be? If you surrender to failure, because that's what you've been told. If you surrender to illness, because that's what you've told is your destiny. If you surrender to weakness, because that's what you've told you are, this energy will have no choice but to surrender to that belief. Krishna says, I have no choice but to make the shape of the person I work through. But he says, if my servant surrenders to me, I also have no choice but to completely surrender to him and serve him endlessly. I've just written this down because my friend told me this just yesterday and I just thought it was amazing, but I wanted to write it down and get it right. This is from the Nigerian language. My friend has a Nigerian heritage. She's a diplomat and she lives in Brazil, and I've been working with her. I was talking to her about the fact that when we surrender to our potential surrenders to us. When we surrender to God surrenders to us. When we surrender to abundance, we recognise that there's abundance, it has no choice but to serve us. That's about a massive change of perception. And she said in her language they have a saying called Onye Kui Chia Kui. Onye Kui Chia Kui. And it means when we say yes to our chi says yes to us. Their word for God is chi. You could call it potential. When we say yes to our potential says yes to us. Our potential has no choice but to surrender to us. But to change the 95% of perception, we have to become aware that we are being led unconsciously 95% of the time. So the reason people don't achieve what they aim to achieve is because every time they go towards it, their conditioning, their dogma, their culture, their religion, their conditioning, their teaching says not for you, not possible for you, not for the likes of you. And their cells are led by that perception. So when we hear that and we believe it, our cells orchestrate themselves and shape themselves like when you put a magnet under a piece of paper. If you put iron filings on a piece of paper and then you put a magnet underneath it, all the iron filings will move around the paper into the shape of the magnet underneath. Our cells are like that. That's where our potential is. If our powerful perception is that it's not possible, every cell will make the shape of impossible. Every cell. 50 trillion cells will say, he says it's not possible. We're led by what he's saying. So they all fall into that line. If your cells are saying the world cannot be trusted, if your perception is saying that the world cannot be trusted, 50 trillion cells fall into the shape of mistrust. If your perception is that you are destined for illness or destined for failure, 50 trillion cells waiting for the order from you will make the shape of illness and failure. If we can recognize that the magnet is our perception, and we change the perception to powerful, to kind, to service, to love. If we change the perception to abundance, if we change the perception to infinite choice, then that's the shape our 50 trillion cells will be forced to make. So then we come to the question, if it's all about perception, which it is, if with a little bit of inquiry, you'll recognise that money is perception, doesn't actually exist as not even as a commodity. It's just it's an exchange of energy with a value that's based on perception. That's what it is. Politics is perception. We can turn an enemy into a friend just by changing perception. So when we recognise that, we have to start asking ourselves, well, if the reality is created by perception, whose perception? If there's 50 trillion cells there, and we've got our cognition and our kind of like our learned perception, and we've got lots of personalities on our mind, lots of different voices, they've all got different agendas, they've all got different perceptions, they've all got different goals, they've all got different aims and ambitions. They're not aligned. So if the world is created by perception, and perception manifests as thought, and then as word, and then as action, whose perception are we listening to?